Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, perhaps, wherever you're joining us in the world today. This conversation is the fifth in a 10-part series celebrating the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance's 10-year anniversary at the University of Canberra, asking 10 big questions in deliberative democracy. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose land the University of Canberra is built, and to pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the contribution that Indigenous systems of knowledge and governance make to our understanding of deliberative democracy, and just invite us all to reflect on that as well. I'd like to thank Ferdinand Sanchez, without whom we would not be able to run these online events so smoothly, and to Del Webb and Nicole Carato for organising the conversation today. So the topic that we're going to be discussing today, the question is, are everyday citizens competent deliberators? Now, when I heard this question, I have to admit I felt maybe a little bit triggered by it. It took me back to the early days of my PhD when presenting my work on deliberative democracy. This is a question that would come up quite a lot. And I realized that my reaction to it today was a reflection on the fact that, well, one, perhaps thinking has moved on to some extent, but also the fact that I probably mostly talk to like-minded people these days, people who are already on board with this idea, and it's not something that I encounter so much. But I'm sure that this question is an important and controversial question for lots of people working in the field of deliberative democracy. And when I reflected a bit further, and I started to unpack the question a little bit, I realized there are so many potential layers in here. So I'm really excited to get into this conversation. And we're lucky to have two wonderful speakers who are going to talk about this today. So we have Professor Daniel Kübler, who's a professor of political science and co-director of the Centre for Democracy Studies at the University of Zurich. His research focuses on, amongst other things, citizen opinion formation, direct democracy, and participation in citizens' assemblies. We also have our very own Professor Simon Niemeyer. Simon is a co-founder of the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the university here. And his research in the field of deliberative democracy includes conceptualizing the nature of deliberative reason and understanding the conditions that support it. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over firstly to Daniel for his introductory remarks. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Lucy. Thanks, Ferds, and all colleagues of this Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance in Canberra for having me today. Now, the role of citizen competence in democracy is a classic topic of democracy theory. As democracy rests on citizen participation, it's clear that this participation can only be meaningful if citizens have an understanding of the implications of the decisions in which they are asked to participate. And this issue is a controversial one, and some democracy theorists are very pessimistic about citizens' ability of reaching sufficient understanding of political issues. And these democracy theorists therefore argue that citizen participation in politics should be limited and should be limited to elections. And even there, it's not clear if citizens can really understand what these elections are about. One of those classic democracy, well, elitist democracy theorists is Joseph Schumpeter, of course, who says that competitive elitism is the only way of really real-world democracy that could work. And then it's interesting to see what these elite theorists such as Schumpeter say about real-world cases where there is a lot of citizen participation that is not limited to election precisely. And I'm talking about Switzerland here, where there is a lot of direct democracy, as you might know, and we vote about 4 times every year on a total of 6 to 10 objects. And these objects can range from rather easy things to understand. For instance, there was one initiative that asked the introduction of a new national holiday, of democracy were right, a polity such as Switzerland should have gone down in flames years ago. And it hasn't done so. So it's interesting to consider what these elitist theories say about Switzerland. There is a very nice and hilarious quote from Joseph Schumpeter, precisely, where he talks about Switzerland. I would like to quote this at length. He says, quote, "There is so little to quarrel about in a world of peasants, which, excepting hotels and a few banks, contain no great capitalist industry. The problems of public policy are so simple and so stable that an overwhelming majority can be expected to understand them." So if Switzerland still exists, it's because things are so simple in this world of peasants. Now, there must be obviously another explanation, because things, as I just explained, are not so simple. And if we look into the opinion formation processes, how people do come up with a yes or a no in the end that they put in the ballot box, there is two strategies we can see how citizens make their opinion. On the one hand, citizens use heuristics. So this is cognitive shortcuts to come to an opinion, even if you don't understand every detail. And these cognitive shortcuts are basically following the elite recommendations to vote. So if you know that your favorite party is the Greens or the Liberals or whatever, they would usually publish a recommendation how to vote yes or no in the next upcoming vote. And citizens simply follow this. And studies have shown that using these heuristics can make sure that you vote consistently with your preference. Now, this is not something that's interesting to the question of competence of citizens, of course, but there's another strategy that citizens follow, which is argument-based. So you weigh the pros, the cons, and then decide about a concrete vote. And here, the role of the elite is crucial. So citizens watch the elite actors in public debates. They read newspapers, they watch television shows on pros or cons of the vote. And then during these debates, they get familiar with the arguments and make a decision then which really weighs the pros, the cons. So my colleague Hans-Peter Kriesi calls for a realistic theory of direct democracy, where we need to consider that citizens are not alone in making up their minds, but they can view and understand well what elite actors say, and build up their own competence. And I would argue that the same mechanisms are at work also in deliberative situations. First of all, when you look at how deliberations are set up, you can see that citizens obviously learn from each other. So when they're in the discussion, they talk about their opinions, about their arguments, and they learn from each other. And second, there is also stakeholders that are often, presenting their views on the issues at stake and try to convince citizens that this or that issue should be taken up, or this and that decision should be made. So there is a transmission also of expert discourse in citizen deliberation. That's how competence, in fact, feeds into the deliberation and how citizens learn and thereby increase their competence. So in the end, I would argue that it's maybe not at the beginning that citizens are the most competent deliberators, but as the deliberation goes on, they gain their competence, and then as an outcome, they may be very much competent citizens after deliberation.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, Simon, over to you. You're muted, Simon.
Okay, of course I'm muted. Can you hear me? Hear me now? Okay, great. Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I was going to take a sort of a slightly similar sort of vein of argument to Daniel, slightly big picture and a little bit theoretical. But the main themes in terms of the argument I would make is follow from Lucy's comments to some extent that it is a little bit triggering this question, but it is worth digging into because we have an element whereby our democratic institutions from my perspective, are built on an assumption of citizen competence, which is problematic. And even worse, it's possible that we could actually think of this as a kind of a form of tragedy in which the skepticism about competence has led to the development of institutions that potentially exacerbate the problem, and potentially even have led to the problem we call the crisis of democracy. So, from my perspective, there is an element of a foundational structural question here, which is very unfortunate. So the research that I've done over the last 20 years has looked into this question and trying to understand human reasoning from a deliberative perspective. And the most persuasive work that I've come across actually is work that challenges the traditional ideas of reasoning, the basis of rationality and so on, and has taken an evolutionary perspective, looking at actually how we evolved to reason and how we evolved to reason in groups, and how that misaligns with the classic conception of reasoning, and has actually led to the ideas of democracy and democratic institutions that have contributed to this problem. And if we actually turn this problem on itself and look at actually how we collectively reason as humans, that actually informs a different set of institutional settings. And skepticism is not only misplaced, it's actually deeply problematic. When we actually look at it, again, from the sort of the human development point of view, it brings into the frame questions like disposition and our orientation, not just our knowledge and our expertise. They're important, of course, as Daniel's mentioned, but they are part of a system. It's a systemic view that we need to adopt. So I'm always skeptical of using a little bit cautious about using slogans. But if I was going to summarize the argument in a sentence, it would be something along the lines of, democracy is built on deliberation and trust, not voting and encyclopedias. So let's see if we can speak to that a little bit. So we turn to the debate, the long-standing debate, as Daniel's mentioned, on the competence of citizens. My argument would be that it actually ends up asking the wrong question. It's certainly the wrong way of framing the question. When we look at the standards of competence historically, they're based around ideas of correctness or ideas of correct sort of formation of choices and preferences that are based on a very narrow conception of utilitarianism and utilitarian rationality. But when we look at the actual development of human reasoning, it's a much richer story. The models of human reasoning that we've used traditionally are focused on ideas of individual competence, with the rationality involving an independent idea of the good, rather than an idea of the good which is emerged and constructed by citizens or people themselves. The many skeptical accounts of competence are based on this idea of rationality, and it's supposed to involve an internal calculus amongst an individual to maximize the benefit to the self, which I think is one of the elements of it which is most triggering to us as deliberative democrats, that often embrace ideas of the common good. So under these sorts of accounts, the average citizen is deemed to fall short of standards of rationality. They often get the facts wrong. But even worse than this, there is a disincentive to even bother to seek the information required to make informed decisions that align with their own interests. So this leads to the idea of a problem of rational ignorance, and this is one of the more common arguments, is that democracy doesn't work because there's not an incentive to inform oneself about what is needed to understand in order to make the decisions that align with our best interests. So in most political settings, we have low incentive to appraise ourselves with information. And in the case of voting, if we actually adopt a rational choice approach to this, and as Daniel's alluded to already, the whole system collapses on itself because people don't bother voting. But we know that people do vote. But the problem with the way we actually have the sort of mainstream approach to discussing this question is one in which democracy is doomed to fail by its own logic. And so the solution that's actually sort of favoured by the skeptics is to sort of relax ideas of what we might understand as strong democracy. And one version of that is to rely on sort of competent elites, and representative democracy is a version of that story, where the good and the great are the ones that make decisions, that keeps citizens at safe distance, but engages them in democracy via the mechanism of voting. And of course, in reality, one democracy is richer than that, but it's still a non-maximalist version. So my main argument is that the model that we've adopted traditionally in human reasoning is not only incorrect, or at least dangerously incomplete. It's been used to justify a democratic model that hardwires and exacerbates the problem of citizen competence. This is built into the fabric of the political system, and that is deeply problematic in itself and part of the problem. And as Daniel has already mentioned, despite this, the democratic system has worked up to a point, but it's worked despite our understanding of human competence and the way we've actually historically tried to deal with this problem.
Okay.
So in terms of, we're out of time.
You're just over 6 minutes. You're good. Do you want to just finish the thought to wrap up? Yeah.
2 points. 2 points to finish. One is, sorry, Lucy, I meant to start a stopwatch. So two main points. So the model's incorrect. We reason collectively, not individually, and a big part of this is actually feedbacks amongst the group. Effectively, we evolved to reason deliberatively. An important part of this is dispositional, not necessarily educational. We don't need to know a heck of a lot of knowledge to be able to deliberate on issues. We just need to know. Part of the problem is knowing who to trust and to make those sorts of judgments. And I'll leave it there, and we'll flesh that out in discussion, hopefully.
Thank you, Simon. So I am now going to ask a question to both of you. I mean, really, this contains a couple of questions within one broader question. So, as Daniel started with his remarks and referred to Schumpeter, and I'm sure lots of us always refer to Schumpeter when we're talking about this notion. And Daniel said, it's a classic issue in democratic theory. And from what Simon said, it's based on, an outdated model of individual rationality. So based off of that, I've been thinking, is this a question that we can really just put to bed? Are we over it, or does it still persist as a contemporary live concern, so to speak, in the field? And I'm thinking here, I know that you've both been involved in the organization and practice of deliberative processes in different settings. So I'm interested to hear your experience from a practice perspective. So when you're organizing these processes, is this a question that comes up? If so, where is it coming from? How is it articulated? Is it still articulated in this sort of classic individual competence setting, or are other concerns coming up? So I'd be interested to hear from your practical experiences on it.
Thank you, Lucy, for this question. Shall I go first, or do you want to go, Simon?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think the question still has a lot of analytical leverage, because it's really interesting to pursue and to analyze how in precise deliberations people learn and make up their minds and start, understanding things that have never thought about before. I think genome editing or the other very tricky issue. We did a couple of deliberations in the past years, and did also some studies of people's understanding of the problem pre-deliberation and post-deliberation. We used, it was notably Francesco Beri who did these studies, and he used a very well-known concept that has been developed by Simon, Francesco, John, Andre Bechtier, and others. It's called deliberative reason index, where you can measure the amount of, let's say, understanding of an issue, and all those data clearly show an increase of the deliberative reason index, so which means that people have gained competence in the deliberation as far as long as this went on. And interestingly, those people with the lowest education level have gained most from this deliberation. So I think there is still some competence gain going on. It can be measured. Now the question, and here I'm completely with Simon, it might not be only a question of learning and of rationality. It might also have to do with building up trust in the group, and as the process goes along. And there are even let's say results from other deliberative processes, notably the citizen assemblies in France, where Helen Vanmore has shown that there is some emotional, good feelings that go along with this process, and that maybe it's not just about exchanging arguments that makes you learn or gain competence, but it's also growing together as a group and developing emotional ties with those groups, love, as we might call it, and respect, at least for others, that is at the basis of this competence gain. And I think, and then there I completely aligned with Sam, we need to understand these mechanisms more closely.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Daniel's saying. I mean, I think from my perspective, we're only just starting to actually understand the nature of human reasoning in a way that really opens up this question in fundamental and very important ways. Just for one example, and of course we've observed this in small scale. One thing that's really interesting about this is that we can have individuals that come with very strong positions that align with what we might call motivated reasoning. And that changes dramatically. And so Francesco and I, one thing I'm working on while I'm here is actually looking at analyzing one of the elements of reasoning is actually an integration of all the various considerations that sort of contrasts with motivated reasoning in terms of thinking narrowly, thinking broadly, and integrating broader perspectives. And it seems that one of the biggest impacts, particularly when it comes to issues like climate change and climate skeptics, is not necessarily correcting knowledge, or that's a part of it, but it's actually integrating, broadening the view on issues rather than focusing on narrow sets of considerations. And education actually potentially makes that worse, because you can actually develop very sophisticated justifications that are very narrowly based. And there's some evidence we have so far where experts are particularly prone to this phenomenon. And it's not necessarily universal, and it's very early days in terms of gathering that evidence. But if you actually look at competence from a different perspective, it really inverts that question in terms of who has the competence to reason democratically and deliberately. So the last point there is that when we actually observe this transformation, it's also associated with a heck of a lot of joy. Helena Landemore was speaking about this the other day. The way that people express, surprisingly, express joy in having actually worked through issues together with people that have different perspectives. And it just changes the way we actually engage the question. And there's some interesting neurobiology that may actually speak to this question, that we actually reason in different ways, sort of in a modular brain. We know about lizard brain, for example, and so on. It may be the case that reasoning deliberatively is actually joyful, and it would make sense from their evolutionary perspective that is joyful, because in the sense that it's beneficial. And I don't want to be get too carried away with this, but there is a lot to explore in this space.